Hello, my renegades. Welcome back to Rogue Radio. My name is Sarah Jane, and today is another episode of Down the Rabbit Hole. Yes, where we talk about creepy history and conspiracy theories because you love it, I love it, we all love it. We all love a little dose of creepy in our lives, right? But surface level creepy, right? Just stuff to make you think at night, alone, in your bed. Staying awake. Like, is that possible? Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am. Yes, person. It is. It is very, very possible. So, brain surgery. What do y'all think about that? Can a certain accident or a certain poke of the ice pick, is it actually able to change the personality of the person who's receiving it? Well, my little friend Phineas Gage is actually living proof of that. One day he was working on the railroad, good, sensible man, very, very sweet, very, very nice, very well-mannered, ends up getting a metal rod stuck right through his frontal lobe, and after that he was never the same. Never, ever the same. After that he was very rude, very violent, and just downright nasty. So yes, I would say it is possible. And today we are going to be talking about the infamous Mad Dr. Walter Freeman. Yes, the Lobotomist. Dr. Walter Freeman was an idealistic doctor who was described as someone who was either an angel of mercy, a madman, or even a genius. When a patient would come into his office, he was described as kind and gentle. And the first patient of Freeman was a woman by the name of Ellen Ionesco. The first patient of a perfected procedure he had refined weeks before. He called it transorbital lobotomy, where the patient would be rendered unconscious by electric convulsive shock, and just before he flipped the switch, the nurses would hold down the patient while the convulsions were happening. Wow. The patient would go unconscious for a brief period and maybe several minutes. Freeman would pry open the eyelids, insert his ice pick hammer into the brain, wiggle it about, and sever the frontal lobes and withdraw it. And then Freeman would give the patient dark glasses to hide the bruising around the eyes. The picture that depicts the bruising kind of reminds me of the conspiracy behind the panda eyes, which is another conspiracy about how elites and celebrities get initiated into the Illuminati. Don't know if there's a connection there, but that this is how my brain works. It's been said that panda eyes are inflicted by forceful sexual acts, but that's what we have been told. It's not a fact, but it may be a possibility that even the Illuminati might be using this tactic in order to subdue their celebrities or their elites, so that, they don't say much. I don't know. But in 1924, neurologist Dr. Walter Freeman arrived in Washington, D.C. at St. Elizabeth's, which was one of the largest hospitals in the nation for the mentally ill. He was the youngest lab director in the hospital's history at the age of 28, and this mental hospital became a dumping ground for those who suffered with mental illness like aggravated depression, dementia, and psychosis. And back in the time, if you showed any type of mental illness, you were taken forcefully to this institution, and there was no way out. There would be really no treatment because the nurses were ill-equipped. No one knew what to do with mental illnesses at the time except place them in specific facilities like this. It was basically a storage house for people who society wanted to forget about. The patients would smear excrement on the walls, tearing off their clothes, and sitting in fetal positions on the floor every single day. I cannot imagine the amount of pain these patients felt, not just because of their mental illness, but that they were dealing with, but with the nurses who had no education on how to take care of them and work with them. As Walter Freeman observed the environment, he wrote later that he had a weird mix of shame, fear, and disgust. He was naturally repelled and sickened by what he saw and hated the sight. He saw lives going nowhere, and he wanted to do something about it. He didn't want to sympathize with mental illness. He wanted to act and treat it. Freeman believed that the physical effects in the brain caused mental illness, and neurologists had already determined distinct parts of the brain that controlled certain actions and thoughts, but they couldn't locate where the brain, where the mental illness, like where in the brain the mental illness comes from. So we knew that the location of the mental illness is in the firing of neurons. Each neuron has to be connected in order to carry certain chemicals like dopamine, serotonin, and misfiring is caused by several things. Generationally, meaning, we can get that passed down from our mother and father, environment, trauma, etc. When the brain undergoes an enormous amount of trauma, the neurons disconnect and the misfiring starts to happen in the brain. This causes the mental illness we see today. When a person heals from trauma, those neurons reconnect over time. The other places the mental illness can be located also is the hippocampus, which is responsible for memory, emotional, and learning. The amygdala, which is responsible for emotional processing, especially fear and anxiety, and the prefrontal cortex, which we will get into in this episode, which is responsible for decision making, social appropriateness, and personality expression and reasoning, which makes sense seeing that most mental illnesses challenge who you are as a person and what your purpose is. These nurses couldn't do much with the people who were emotionally and mentally spent from their mental illnesses. Nurses would have to watch those who were suicidal until they spontaneously recovered from their melancholia, which could go on for months. These nurses would have to watch them for months, and if they tried to act, they would have to force them and subdue them to the point of maybe sedation or even restraint in order to keep them from hurting themselves. And they go on through that for months. That's crazy. In the 1930s, this is when electroshock therapy came into play. And mind you, it still goes on today for whatever demented reason. I know people have their opinions about mental health treatment, but I would give a hard pass for electroshock therapy. And yeah, no. If I were a psychologist, if I were a therapist, I would definitely just give a hard pass to electroshock therapy. I would not even consider that to my patients. But this shock therapy was to try to reroute the circuitry of the brain. These patients were brought to the edge of death through intentional overdose of the hormone insulin or metrazole, which triggered violent seizures that often snapped the vertebrae. God. Through this process, patients later wrote their experiences explaining it to be torture, asking them why they were tormenting them, and asking them if they were going to kill them. That's how much fear was in these patients. They really thought that they were going to kill them. Some of them didn't even give consent to this type of torment. After the shock therapy, the patients were quieter and more docile for a period. Let me be clear, it didn't help them miraculously recover or cure them. It took away the symptoms for a certain amount of time at a terrible cost. For Freeman, this was evidence that there were physical defects in the brain. Walter Freeman wanted to be the first man to find the location of the defects in the brain. And as a young man, he believed that he was destined for greatness and most likely was following in his grandfather's footsteps. William Keene, who was a pioneer brain surgeon who performed surgeries in front of a watching audience, because back in the day, there really was no thought of anyone to film this. So most of the time, an audience would be the audience would surround a platform, and that platform was where they operated on the patient. And it was basically like a medical theater. They were able to take notes on a live patient in order to learn about how the body reacts to surgeries and how to fix the body and all that stuff. This is what they did back in the day. This was normal for them, to just bring a body, subdue them with anesthesia, and go at it. Blood and all. Blood, guts and all. That's crazy. But that's just how that was. That's how they learned. But anyway, Walter graduated in 1920 and married an economist and moved to Washington, D.C., where they had 4 children. He became obsessed with the treatment of mental illness and was convinced that he was born for medical greatness. Walter Freeman spent a lot of time at St. Elizabeth's morgue in the basement photographing and measuring the brains of mental patients. But of course he came up empty with no evidence of any lesions in the brain during his autopsies. He was obsessed with making his mark on the world of mental health, and he suddenly did. He made a discovery from the inspiration of a Portuguese neurologist, Egas Moniz. And he detailed the operation performed on a group of 20 mental patients at the time. Taking small corings of their brains, it was possible to rid the patients of a third of their symptoms. Moniz had no theory on why this operation would work in the first place. He just had a notion that it would work. For years, doctors suspected that the frontal lobe was the main area of where the mental illness was located. It was suspected that damaging the frontal lobe would make the patient more docile and less anxious, and Moniz had found that physically altering the frontal lobes would be revolutionary to curing mental illnesses. So, for most mainstream medicine, the idea was frowned upon, and Freeman took this idea and ran with it, of course. Freeman would have free reign and wouldn't have any problem facing the government or the medical society because there was no form of consent for patients. The physicians were bosses of their own and wards, were bosses of their own wards and would do what they wanted to their patients. But Freeman had no license to perform surgery. And so he hired James Watts, who was young and willing to help. Did it work? Oh, there it is. My bad. Alright. Within months, they would start their procedure on a living patient. They chose 63-year-old Alice Hammett, who suffered with insomnia, anxiety, and depression, and her husband brought her into Freeman because she was being on the verge of being institutionalized. And Freeman chose her as a good possible patient because of the close symptoms and diagnosis to Monice's patients. September 1936, Freeman and Watts prepared for her surgery. He made some incisions and drilled some holes and separated the incisions. So basically what he did, he made incisions and drilled the holes and then separated those incisions. So he basically split the brain? That's terrifying. But anyway, instead of taking corings from the brain, he decided to cut the nerves. Oh my god. It just gives me the willies, I'm sorry. Ooh. He cut the nerves that connected the frontal lobes to the thalamus. I cannot tell you how pissed I was hearing this. Severing the nerves between the two lobes causes a number of problems. Bleeding and abscesses in the brain, apathy, dementia and epilepsy, intellectual impairment, disinhibition and inappropriate social behavior, incontinence, obesity, and brain infection. I had to look up those symptoms. I literally Googled that and I was like, holy crap. Like that's almost, you rendered this person an unfunctional human being by cutting those nerves. This person cannot function in any area of their life because of what he did. But then again, education was so vague back in the day. Compared to now, how we know how the brain works, I feel like we're more careful, a lot more. There is definitely room for improvement when it comes to the brain and how we treat it and how we deal with it. But as far as what Freeman did, that's nuts. It's nuts. But anyway, Alice Hammett awoke showing a placid expression and later didn't show any anxiety or fear. After that, Freeman and Watts started doing more lobotomies and reported good results. But after 3 or 4 months, they started to relapse, these patients. And that caused Watts and Freeman to do second operations on these patients. So I'm not sure if nerves reconnect or heal after being severed, but some type of something was going on in the brains of these patients. And that's how they started relapsing. I'm not sure if there's a healing process between nerves being disconnected. So I can't really say for sure if that's what's been happening, but there were symptoms that I did talk about which probably caused them to relapse in the process of these symptoms developing in them. So for some horrible reason they started to perform the lobotomy on conscious patients. I can't speak. Conscious patients. And taking cues. I'm sorry, this is not funny. Jesus Christ. I'm laughing because of the shock. Like, yes, I've watched the documentary and I've typed up the report, but listen, reading it again is like relearning everything that I wrote down. But conscious patience and taking cues from reactions and giving the patient to do things like counting backwards from 100 by sevens, reciting the presidents, or sing a song, or even the Lord's Prayer. Like, they had to make sure that the brain was functioning while they were operating on it, which is nuts. I don't understand that. But by the time he had performed the lobotomy on dozens of patients, he was ready to call the procedure a success. But even the patients with the best outcomes had side effects. Even though the patients weren't showing any agitation externally, it didn't mean that they were cured. Most patients were not able to develop social skills, and they lacked energy, demobilized, and they were like that for the rest of their lives. So by doing this, like, the brain is a very, very fragile thing. It is responsible for so many different things in the body. Without the brain, you cannot survive. Literally. The brain stem, specifically, if that gets ruptured or if that gets damaged in any way, you die, because that controls your breathing. The occipital lobe, if that gets hurt in any way, you're blind. If your temporal lobes get hurt, you go deaf. There are so many things that the mind controls in your body. It is basically the operating station, the control center of your whole body. It's what helps your heart beat. It's what helps your blood pump. It sends signals to the body every single day, whether you believe it or not, or whether you consider that fact or not. That is real. So the fact that Dr. Freeman and Watts are actually messing and playing around with the brain, trying to figure out how to cure mental illness, they're also handicapping people in certain ways. Like I said, like people who, if you mess with a certain lobe of the brain, that person cannot get that back. It's called the use it or lose it policy in psychology. I've taken a psychology class back in high school, and that was the one thing that I took from that class, is that if you do not use part of your brain, you will lose it. Or if there is something that damages the brain, you cannot return from that. Maybe science and neurology has kind of like how is that? How am I supposed to say that? I'm trying to figure out how to say that. Maybe it's different now because it's been years ago since I learned that. Maybe we can get things back that we have lost from our mind physically and emotionally and mentally. But back in the day, that's what I learned. That if something in the mind gets damaged to the point of no return, you can't get that back. You cannot get that back. It's like losing teeth. If you lose a tooth, you're never ever going to get it back. But anyway, they would behave in a very childlike manner, these patients, and had to be retaught how to talk and walk. Even go to the bathroom. They had incontinence, like I said. They reverted to childhood and even suffered from overeating. Freeman and Watts announced that they had a new cure for mental illness in a medical conference in Baltimore and report the results. Anyway, the conference was charged with anger and indifference, and they were interjected and shouted down by the physicians in the room. They were outraged and stunned that they would even try such a thing on patients because it was an untested procedure. He even begged for time to perfect the procedure. He promised that the lobotomy would be a last resort operation. At the time, no one spoke badly publicly about another physician. They would talk amongst themselves, but it was unethical to write publicly or publish anything that would demean the practice of another doctor, so that gave him the freedom to his credibility. So this guy turns around and starts praising his own work in the press. Because of that fact, that no one else can say anything bad about another doctor, that was some sort of unspoken rule in the community at the time of doctors and neurologists and all that. He ended up praising his own work in the press. So he basically made appointments to interview himself and go ahead and post this stuff in the paper. So yeah, since no other doctor can come out publicly about the malpractice of another, Freeman took that open door and opened it wide to let the world know that he was a great doctor. The press ate it up, and they ran with it, saying that he had the cure to mental illness, and he was removing the illness from the brain. He made himself into a medical hero. In 1941, Freeman got a call from Joseph P. Kennedy, the ambassador of England, and had become concerned about his eldest daughter, Rosemary, who was slow at birth and now became aggressive, throwing fits and running away from the convent that she resided at. Her father was concerned that she may get pregnant and discredit his and her brother's political careers. Kennedy sought the best medical advice, and someone suggested lobotomy as a solution. That September, at the age of 23, Rosemary became Freeman's 66th lobotomy patient, and the results were a train wreck. Before the operation, she was somewhat able to live independently, but after, she was seriously disabled and had to live under almost full-time care for the rest of her life. Any other doctor could quit the practice altogether from the embarrassment for some reason, but for some reason, Freeman was undeterred after this. He certainly overlooked the mistakes with enthusiasm and dismissed the casualties of his practice. That is what you call narcissism, which is also a mental illness. After World War II, the hospitals flooded with injured and traumatized soldiers from shell shock, from PTSD, you name it. 1946, Life magazine published an article called Beldam, an expose of Pennsylvania, Byberry's, and Ohio's Cleveland State mental hospitals. The country had already been traumatized by the reality of Nazi atrocities, and the traumatized military men, and these pictures that shone the hellish treatment of the patients were getting reminded of the nation of concentration camps. So the nation was already starting to be reminded of concentration camps, when they saw these pictures from the asylum. So it looked like a concentration camp. So people were huddled naked along the walls, strapped to benches, and in straitjackets. Freeman was all too familiar with the environments of mental hospitals and felt he had a treatment in which to end the suffering and cement his reputation. He decided to simplify the procedure because it was expensive and he always needed to hire an anesthesiologist and a surgeon. He needed an operating room and a way to sanitize his tools, which the mental hospitals could not provide. So the whole procedure was very, very expensive in order to prepare the room, prepare the tools, and all of that stuff, and hire the right people. So he had found a way that was simple and less costly. He found a way to punch through the orbital cavity to get to the frontal lobe, and the area of the skull was thin enough for the sharp object to perforate. Freeman used an ice pick from an ice box that many civilians had in their home. The pick was placed above the eyeball and in the plane of the nose, and the doctor could feel the top of the orbit. With the knock of a hammer, you could punch through the frontal cortex. I'm always reminded by this movie called Sucker Punch. If you guys have not watched that, it's an interesting movie, but basically the main character, baby girl, she ends up getting a lobotomy because she had disobeyed the whole asylum, and the lobotomist pokes through her frontal lobe. Spoilers if you've never seen that movie, but and she's basically just rendered speechless. She's not able to think for herself. She's a prisoner of her own mind after that. But that's exactly what happens when it comes to a lobotomy. That's as simple as it gets. But once in, he would have to move the pick like a windshield wiper back and forth and return to the position it was in and hold gauze over the eyeball and withdraw the ice pick. It took 3 to 4 minutes for the procedure to finish. Watts, in March of 1946, he discovered Freeman performing the lobotomy in their shared office, and he had a patient in the office with ice picks sticking out of both eyes. Oh my God. No. And the psychopath casually asks Watts to hold the ice picks while he took a photo. Anyway, he had no surgeon license, and he was practicing this on a patient. That's illegal. I don't really need to say that. That's illegal. Watts simply walked out because this was not an operating room, nor was this being done by a surgeon. And after that, he didn't share an office with Freeman any longer. Freeman kept going, convinced that any psychologist could perform this within minutes. And in the mid-1940s, he forged on and started going to other hospitals to train others in lobotomy. He was getting a high off shocking people, and he would perform this over and over again with cameras and eager audiences. Sometimes he wouldn't even use a surgical hammer. He would just use a carpenter's hammer. Oh my God. Okay, start doing things right-handed and left-handed, then finish off left-handed. So, like, he would start with his right hand, which is his dominant hand, and then end with his left hand. Like, oh, look at me. You know, it's like a sideshow in a circus. Like, hey, look what I can do. Anyway, he proudly wrote about professionals fainting during his procedure or vomiting. To some professionals through the ice, some professionals, though, the ice pick lobotomy was a godsend. He had made a procedure that was cheap, easy, and used on an outpatient basis. He did 25 transorbital lobotomies in one day, and he had trained a psychiatrist who did 75 lobotomies in one day. His daughter teased him and called him the Henry Ford of lobotomy, and he loved it. The number of lobotomies done soared from 150 in 1945 to 5,000 in 1949. At this time, the families of patients chose the lesser of two evils, meaning some would rather them be more docile and calmer and less violent than they originally were. A patient by the name of Beulah Jones started hearing voices and believed that she was the Queen of Scotland, the lost Queen of Scotland, mind you. Her husband, Herbert, committed Beulah to Pilgrim State Hospital, and doctors suggested a lobotomy, and her husband agreed to it. She was one of the 12 lobotomy patients that was practiced on, and that day there was no change in her behavior. She was still violent, and the only change was that she couldn't read or write properly. Her higher intellect was taken from her. Within 6 months of observation, she was just as delusional as she was before the procedure, and once they found out that the lobotomy did not work on her, she was placed in a ward for untreatable patients, and no one bothered her again. That is such a sad situation to be in. To have delusions and then undergoing a traumatizing procedure, to only come out the same, minus the intellect. Most failures were going unnoticed and were practiced in elite medical institutions. One man had barricaded himself in his bedroom with a hatchet and was going to kill his wife, one of, Freeman's patients. And someone remembered that this was Freeman's patient. And so Freeman was called, and he dressed and came out, pounded on the door to the man's bedroom, letting him know it was him, and when he was actually coaxed out of the bedroom, Freeman told the policeman to hold the man down, and he proceeded to do bilateral transorbital lobotomy on him in his own home. He promised this procedure would be the last resort, and now it was a procedure that he could do anywhere at any time. And he would line up psych patients and perform this action, and had no consent from the patients or the families. Freeman was slowly becoming a little god of his practice. At Cherokee State Hospital, 3 of his patients died on the operating table. I'm getting to the point where reading is starting to get a lot harder because I've been talking a lot. But on the operating table, and 1 died because of the ice pick slipping while taking a photo. God help me. Without hesitation, he packed up and left for his next demonstration like it was nothing. I was like, oh, okay, 3 people died, it's fine, let's go to the next patient. His crusade was aimed at lifters, those abandoned by their families and living for years in the wards. So he basically went like cross country at this point. So he went on a crusade that he called his West Virginia Lobotomy Project, which over a 30-day period in the nation's poorest states, he would operate on 238 or 8 per day. His favorite place to visit was the small town of Lakin, which was home to a hospital of African American patients. They had limited resources in the mental hospital. They had no clothes or towels, and they only could give the patients sheets. The state threatened to close down the place, but of course Freeman, being the narcissist he is, promised the lobotomy would get them back home to their families. The mid-1950s, the first long-term clinical studies started on lobotomy and published them in medical journals. Now people could assess the impact of the lobotomy. Some were in vegetated states, some were unchanged, and some were able to go home but had the behavior of a child. The hype of this procedure started to become discredited because of the advanced studies done as the times modernized. Mind you, he started in the 1930s and now it was the 1950s. Research and study is bound to change. Lobotomy was really no more subtle than a gunshot to the head, a former supporter declared. I'm separating pages because I'm almost done. With the tidal wave of criticism coming from all fronts now, Freeman had a short fuse with critics. So if someone wanted to criticize the malpractice of him at a meeting, he would immediately turn around and say, what they have done. What have you done for a patient who was suffering from schizophrenia or mental illness? And of course, they couldn't say anything because they couldn't do anything. Psychoanalysts at the time didn't know how bad it was inside the mind of a mentally ill patient, and Freeman was trying to cure them of that. And he believed that if someone had to suffer with obesity or something else, it was a small price to pay for their mental anguish. He pointed out a high rate of suicides that these patients had and declared that he was helping them. Many of his patients and their families did believe that they had helped them. During a speech with an audience of psychiatrists, he was heckled and he pulled out a box of 500 Christmas cards and dumped them on the table and said, "How many Christmas cards do you get from your patients?" These supporters were manipulated into believing that their family members were cured, even though they mostly had childlike behaviors. They had chosen the lesser of two evils and preferred this evil to deal with the violent tendencies of their loved ones. So they basically was like, do I want a violent person in my life, or do I want a docile one that can hardly function? And they chose the lesser of two evils. Even if it meant that their family members were sometimes in vegetated states. Thorazine started to come into practice in pill form in 1954, and this was seen as a chemical lobotomy and created results like the procedure without the violent taboo action of the ice pick lobotomies. Overnight, his opportunities started to dwindle, and his office in Washington University was closed. He didn't give up the practice, for that would be giving up on who he was as a neurologist. He moved to Los Altos, California, to bring his career back to life, and tried to bring the lobotomy to the new categories of patients, like housewives, misbehaving misbehaving children or ADHD kids. This is just getting worse and worse. But anyway, Howard Dully was 12 when he was brought to see him. And Freeman was told that he was becoming disrespectful and occasionally violent at home. Dully believed that his stepmom was trying to replace his mom, which was reasonable thought in a kid's mind when their mom dies, and that was the reason for his misbehavior. So Dully had experienced the loss of his own birth mother, and his dad had remarried. And so he didn't really want to obey his stepmom because he thought that, you're replacing my mom. And I mean, as a 12-year-old kid, that is reasonable thought. I mean, their mind doesn't necessarily function in a level like an adult's. So this a lobotomy isn't something that a child should ever go through. Anyway, his stepmom took him to Freeman took him to Freeman a dozen times to be evaluated. In his notes, he says that he wouldn't wish Howard on anyone. This is what Freeman says, and that he needed a transorbital lobotomy just for the things that kids normally did, like daydreaming and not washing up, having irregular body temperature, and being disrespectful. These were the reasons why Freeman did this to this child. So he lobotomized Howard Dully, and Howard didn't know that the procedure had been done to him until Freeman said something, and he didn't even want to know anything more, because as a boy he believed that maybe he deserved it. Maybe he deserved what was done to him. After that, Howard believed that there was something wrong with him, that a piece of his life was missing, because his life didn't go very well after that. His judgment and drive aren't good. He isn't able to handle jobs, relationships, money, the proper way either. He lobotomized 19 children under the age of 18, including a 4-year-old. Oh my God. 1967, Freeman personally performed 2,900 lobotomies in Herrick Memorial Hospital in Berkeley. He performed his last lobotomy after a patient died of a brain hemorrhage. He was stripped of his medical privileges and retired from the practice. In conclusion, he wanted to feel good about what he was doing. He wanted to do something in the name, or in a time that no one could do anything about within mental health, which is a reasonable aspiration, but I do believe that he was very miseducated, very undereducated when it came to this. And when people were telling him that it was wrong, he did not allow himself to be taught, which is something that is a very important thing, to let yourself be taught. Don't always think that you're a know-it-all, because you really don't know it all, no matter what. But he embarked on one journey, talking to his patients about the lobotomies that he had practiced, and making sure that they were okay. He went out telling his patients that the transorbital lobotomy wasn't the revolutionary magical cure that it was made out to be. Walter Freeman died in March 31st, 1972. Lobotomy in modified form is still used in rare cases of OCD at hospitals around the world. Today, lobotomy is rarely performed. However, shock therapy and psychosurgery, the surgical removal of specific regions of the brain, occasionally are used to treat patients whose symptoms have resisted all other treatments and had I had to fact check this since the doctor, since the document was dated. The documentary, sorry, Jesus. The documentary was dated, so I had to make sure that I could fact check that. But, let's see. This has to be a very tragic story in surgical history. Freeman is by no means innocent for what he did. He damaged the many lives of patients. He did it out of wanting so much to help someone recover from mental illness. But in return, because of his wish to be great, he actually done more harm than good. So, let me just say this. We're back in 2024. We're done with going back in time and talking about Dr. Freeman. In the world of mental health, there is always something to learn. There is always something to be educated on. I believe not just in the subject of mental illness. Any type of subject that you learn is ever evolving. You will never understand everything all at once. Just like everything else is evolving, technology is evolving. Therefore, mental illness, there are many different revolutionary things that are happening in mental illness to this day. And the one thing that I know working in mental health is that it is a process to recover. It is a long, hard process to recover from whatever you are going through, whether it be depression, OCD, schizophrenia. All of that stuff is a process with medication, therapy, occupational therapy, activities in order to distract yourself from your own thoughts. All of that plays into treating mental health. And that is something that I want to leave you guys with, is that if a lobotomy is considered, nowadays it is, I would say, more perfected than it is, or than it was back in the day, and is only used as a very, very last resort for patients with a deformity in the brain. But I would say, please let yourself go through the process of recovery from a mental illness first. Because it might not just be mentally, it's also emotionally that you have to go through the recovery process. It's kind of like how someone ends up going to rehab for being addicted to drugs. It's a process to recover from that and be clean. I would say it's kind of the same thing. And a lot of people might disagree with me on that. I believe that you can recover from a mental illness and have it not be so prevalent in your life to where it takes over your life and it disables you. I'm living proof of that. But it is a process. To any type of healing, there is a process. It's not overnight. It's never really miraculous when it comes to mental illness. Those types of healings, that type of healing, that type of recovery is a process, and I just want to leave you with that. But thank you so much for listening, and I will see you in the trenches next time. Love you.